Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about pitfalls and Agile. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, what would you say are the common pitfalls an organization encounters when scaling Agile and how can they be avoided? I would say the main scaling problem with Agile is that you start using Agile as a tool that only benefits the people who are doing the evaluation of how the work is going. In other words, the Scrum Master or the product manager or anything like that, right? And although the intention here is to be able to manage expectations, plan things out, and so forth and so forth, what inevitably happens is that these people get further and further into the rituals that you apply in different agile work methodologies. The most extreme one that I argue is, say, SAFe. And what now happens is that the focus is no longer to ship software as quickly as possible. The focus is to use SAFe first and foremost, so that you think, at the very least, most people think that you can ship software as quickly as possible. But in practice, there are, I argue at the very least, easier methods to do this. And what I usually see is that most of the software teams absolutely hate working with SAFe. They absolutely hate all the rituals and so forth, because what basically happens is that the process of measurement or planning is more tedious than actually just doing the work, where you get to a point where everything you do gets micro-planned to the point where it's hard for software developers to actually do the things that I argue that they should be doing. A very good example is that the teams that I work with, some of them, they get so indoctrinated into the Agile work methodology that they don't do things like writing tests because there's not a story card for it. They don't do things such as Boy Scouting the code or things like that because, it's not part of the Agile process and so forth. I'm not saying necessarily that it's all down to the fact that you're using the Agile process, right? Or whichever, like in this case, they're using SAFe. But what basically happens is that the planning takes front and center versus delivery. And the way that I've always found it to be a slightly more effective way of shipping value, as I like to call it, as opposed to going as it's sort of as an extreme. Either you do no planning and everything is just chaos basically, or you do so much planning that it becomes almost micromanagement. And I always argue for that the sweet spot is where you have just enough of the thing so that it gives you the results that you're looking for and no more. And the reason why I want it to be no more is because I want to provide the people involved a bit of flexibility, and I want to teach them the necessary mindset that they need in order to use that flexibility effectively. Because the only time I argue that you really need a rule or a process for something is if it's something I know that if we don't have it, there's going to be issues, and I know that we're going to have to align so that some great purpose can be achieved. But all the individual decisions and all the stuff, like because that's the thing that usually happens. I've seen some horror cases where, it honestly gets to a point where I'm wondering if the developers are thinking for themselves whatsoever. Because as I said, it gets to a point where the rituals are so important that that's all that really matters, and you have tons and tons of meetings that basically all are there just to verify that you've done your part and stuff like that. And I've always found that there is a slightly easier method. My personal method I will give you, and I think it avoids most of the problems with this, but it's not perfect by any means, because fundamentally I will argue at the very least the reason why you have so many companies and organizations using Agile and this or SAFe or Scrum, or it doesn't really matter what they're using. It really comes down to the belief system of the people who are involved, and that comes basically down to personal flavor. I've never seen a work process that could definitively prove that it was more effective than something else. So of course mine is going to be just as subjective and opinionated as all the others. But I've always found that it is the healthiest way, at the very least. From all the teams I work with, they usually prefer this method, assuming now, as I said, that they're actually able to deal with like having a little bit of personal freedom and taking that responsibility. So what I usually do is that I create the vast majority of Kanban boards, at the very least, they have the concept of an epic, and then you might have a feature, and then you might have something like a story or a PBI or so forth and so forth, and then you have tasks. That's at least how it works. In like, there's a few nuances. I've been using Azure DevOps for the longest time now, so that's of course the way I think about it, but I used Jira as well, and they have similar sort of construct. And so the way that I slice it is that the minimum unit of something, and this is where that can sort of differ, because some people go all the way down to the task level, where you literally spend hours and hours and hours on just defining what the tasks individuals should have, which is, as I said, write unit tests, like depending on how you do it now, right? So you're basically using the entire, depending on how big it, how much of this you're gonna do. Like, because if you do it in the whole team, you have literally the whole team sitting and planning out every micro detail of a story. And in essence, I argue that if you have software developers who are not capable of understanding what tasks should be involved in shipping a story, then you have a really big problem, because you're basically dealing with people who seem to need to define what they're actually going to do at the micro level, and it gets to almost to a point where it's almost like a robot, where you're literally just saying exactly what they're going to do, right? So what I usually do is that I tell the software developers that tasks, the things that you're supposed to be doing and so forth in the story, that's up to you to figure out. You are very welcome to invite anybody to like program with you, or like Rubber Duck or stuff like that. But the way that I structure the Kanban board is that I have stages. Like, basically, if you imagine the Kanban board from left to right, the columns are in a very simple setup now. So it's going to be ready for work, or new, like something we're going to pick up, ongoing, testing, code review, and then testing, and then done, basically. Or like there might be more columns, but because the reason why you want to structure that way is because I don't want to have a bunch of story cards saying that you should write test, because that is something that should happen in every single story. Therefore it is a column. In other words, the column I use in order to express a phase of delivery. So that means that every single story goes through that exact phase every single time. I don't have to make a card for it, and so forth and so forth. So in other words, if something is always going to be part of a story, have it as a column. Once I've done that, I have a sit down with my developers, and then I say, all right, we're going to talk features now. And so I talk to the product manager and ask them, what are the most important features that we want to deliver, right? And for me, a feature is a collection of stories cards. In other words, a feature might be, like, let's say, for example, you're going to ship a new form, or like a UI element or something like that. Well, two very natural stories that come into play there is make front-end part, like the UI and stuff like that, and then make a back-end part. That's two stories. So in theory, you can work two people, or like depending on how you slice it out, you can have many stories, right? But the feature is just a collection of stories that is going to tie in to delivering the feature, the thing that you're actually going to use. And the feature can be like an entire new experience. So as I said, like just a UI component or something like that. We define it together. What is the feature? But that is the shipment of value. The feature represents the thing that the user wants in order to be able to use the system in some way, or that they desire, right? And then the epic is a collection of features. And then I treat that very similar to how we use package versioning, for example, where you create a version 1, version 2, or version 1.2. We have Semver and other versioning systems. And the epic is literally just, we sit down and we say, how many features of like all the features we have now do you think that we're going to be able to fit in the first delivery? And then we just say, all right, so in this first delivery, we think we're going to do that in this amount of time. There's 2 features or 3 features or 1 feature, so it doesn't really matter. And now you and me and the key team, we all commit to that is what we're going to fix, and that's what we're going to do, right? And if we discover later that something changed or something like that, and we don't like have any really good reason for basically adding more stuff to the current feature, the current epic. Then it goes into the next epic, and every epic is just, you can imagine an epic and a version of the application. There's almost a one-to-one mapping between it. Every time you ship an epic, that's a new version of code that is coming out, or a new updates and things like that. And I have never found that to be any less effective when it comes to actual like delivering developer happiness and all that sort of stuff than having like all the other methods. The one thing that it doesn't give you, of course, is perhaps like extreme insight into every little micro detail and so forth and so forth. So it's a bit looser than like say safe and so forth, but it works pretty well for me at the very least. So what I want you to take away from this is that the most common pitfall with Agile is that you start hiring like Scrum Master and Agile comes like the fanfare and rituals become so gigantic, a gigantic presence in the development that it almost feels like the actual writing of the code is less important than writing down that you're going to do it and then planning it and stuff like that. And I've only ever seen that, depending on how far you go here, that when it gets to the level where you have like full-time Agile coaches and Scrum Masters and stuff like that, it, depending on the team, it is necessary, but many times you bloat your entire delivery process to a point where like it's scary. Like where I see like teams who have 4 releases per year because that's how much process they have around delivering something. And to me that is insane. Because basically I've tried it a few times actually just to sort of prove a point. I've told them this: all right, let's plan and deliver according to your process, changing a single line of CSS. Let's see, how long does that take? And in other words, what usually happens is that the time it takes to plan that thing is longer than doing it. And to me, that seems like, well, now you might want to figure out if there's more flexible ways for you to deal with these sorts of problems, because a process that costs more than the value it ships seems a little bit much to me. Have a great day.